The Nixon administration said today that it has no intention of permitting a communist military victory in South Vietnam, that the intensified American bombing of North Vietnam is an expression of that determination.
Though you might hear laughing, spinning, swinging madly across the sun, it's not aimed at anyone, it's just escaping on the run. And but for the sky there are no fences facing. And if you hear vague traces of skipping reels of rhyme to your tambourine in time, it's just a ragged clown behind. I wouldn't pay it any mind. That's just a shadow you're seeing that he's chasing.
And it's also around this time that, because I mentioned earlier that the grand jury is in private, there's loads of other bodies start investigating it because they want it to come out. There's all different sorts of committees within the American sort of bureaucracy that can look into it. There's like a foreign affairs or an armed services committee that starts questioning people about what they did or didn't do. But the main one is a Senate hearing.
Sure. That's
the one where there's, if you've ever seen any of the footage of people giving...
Yeah, totally. They're up on the
testimony.
like a judge's bench.
And the head of that committee was a guy called Senator Sam Irving, sort of an old southern senator, but, kind of savvy.
Sam Irving was the man for the job. He was a Democrat but conservative, a former judge. His fellow senators knew him as a nonpartisan authority on the Constitution and the Bible, and as wily an old country boy as ever came out of North Carolina.
The chairman is fond of pointing out from time to time that he is just a country lawyer. He omits to say that he graduated from Harvard Law School with honors.
If the senator from Tennessee will yield, I'd like to say a word in my own defense on that point. I had a friend introduce me to North Carolina audience. He said he understood I was a graduate of Harvard Law School, but thank God nobody would ever suspect it.
And that's where they eventually start bringing people up. Whoever went before the grand jury, the Senate, the Watergate Senate hearings, will bring them up, and that's televised. So, in other words, people will get to hear what went down in the grand jury case about it all.
Sure.
Now, this went on to become almost serialized, apparently. In America, they would show it every single day on the TV, and even sort of stops showing other shows in prime time to air the Senate Watergate hearings. A bit like the OJ case, when everyone apparently became fixated with it. So it became like a soap opera.
Yeah.
A bit. But again, all this played out over months, and for long periods it wasn't that interesting, apparently. Yeah. They'd speak to lower guys, and the general public weren't all that interested. And then something explosive would happen, some new revelation, and... Yeah, sorry, what was you going to say?
I was just... When you said about other senators obviously being involved and stuff, and I just wondered... Nixon's just won this enormous landslide victory, but not quite retained control of the Senate.
Of the Congress,
sorry.
Yeah.
So, presumably, there was no question of him being Republican candidate, right? It's not usually, they don't usually challenge an incumbent president, right? I don't know, but what was he standing like within his party at this time? Like, were there people trying to back him up? Like, were there other Republican senators sort of coming out in his defence and? Like,
sure.
There's a whole party machine, isn't there? It's not just his presidential staff. There's
So so he didn't control Congress, but there was a guy. There's Barry Goldwater. You may have heard of him.
Yeah.
People talk about Goldwater conservatism. He was sort of a supporter of Nixon. There's another guy called Wiggins, Senator Wiggins. He was one of the last guys to admit that Nixon was just completely corrupt and a liar. And so he had his defenders, certainly.
Yeah.
Even right at the end, just before he was going to be impeached, I think he could have still relied on 5 or 10 votes in the Senate, something like that. So he did have some support, but it sort of ebbed away from him over months. Like I say, this sort of played on and on for a while, and his support just slowly
dwindled.
Ebbed away.
I guess it became pretty toxic, sort of, after a while, you know.
Yeah, absolutely,
people cut him off and
there's
themselves.
a cancer on the presidency, and we'll get to that because that's an actual quote as well.
I began by telling the president that there was a cancer growing on the presidency, and if the cancer was not removed, the president himself would be killed by it.
One of the last people to completely desert Nixon, actually, was someone in his cabinet, George Bush Sr.
Right, yeah.
George Bush Sr. was, even like in the dark days, would come to Nixon and say, is there anything I can do to help you? I'll go on record and say, you've still got my support. So, yeah, a lot of the Watergate burglars just plead guilty. Liddy doesn't plead guilty, actually, but they're worried about that because I think he could then later be forced to answer. You know, he can't take the fifth. He pleaded innocent, but he took the fifth, so he didn't actually have to say anything.
Right.
But that's worrying because you might be forced to say something in Senate hearings and things.
Oh, really? You can't? There's not a defence?
No, you can't plead the fifth.
Can't do that. Right.
No. So, yeah, it's a completely different ballgame, really.
Wow.
But, of course, what you can do, and what loads of people do, is just say, I don't recall that conversation.
Yeah.
Like, how often does that happen when you get...
Yeah.
You get someone, you go, I just don't recall. And what can you say?
I didn't recall to that. Yeah, I can't remember one way or the other, to be honest. I don't remember.
And it actually comes to the point where Nixon starts coaching some of his people, saying exactly that sort of thing. Saying, just so you don't recall. Yeah. Again, Nixon keeps complaining about the fact that LBJ and the FBI had him bugged in '68. But yeah, it's just no defence, that. It's just no defence. And Haldeman and Ehrlichman and Coulson and his closest guys don't really say that. They just go, yeah, the Democrats are bastards, aren't they?
So childish, isn't it? Like,
yeah.
That's
not what you need.
Yeah, no one's going to buy that. Like, or not even buy that it's, whether it's true or not, but like no one will care. That's just not a legitimate response to you've committed a crime, is it?
Yeah. The guy that's the judge of the case is a guy called Judge John Sirica, and what he does is important because it allows the Watergate hearings to use things that were used at the grand jury. So, for example, if Judge John Sirica insists, this is a bit later in the story, but if he insists that the Nixon tapes, no one knows that these tapes exist at the moment, but if Judge John Sirica asks the tapes to be played for the grand jury, then later the Senate hearings can ask to hear the tapes as well. Do you see?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So whatever John Sirica does can be really, really important. Now, he's not really sympathetic to Nixon's angle. He's a conservative guy, I think a Republican, but he cares about the law more.
Sure.
So he's just trying to get to the truth and doesn't really care if, who it gets to in the White House. And now Nixon obviously just pisses him off. He's like, who is this guy? Who is this goddamn cocksucker? And all the people around him are like, oh no, he loves you. He's like conservative to the core. He's just, he just thinks the law is above anything else.
Law, right, yeah.
And Nixon's just pissed off. It's just so transparent that Nixon just doesn't really care about the rule of law. Yeah, at this point, Coulson says that they should really start thinking about throwing Mitchell under the bus, because if it's going to get to Magruder, then it's going to get to Mitchell, and maybe they should just think about cutting their losses and throw him under the bus. But it just gets into a weird sort of fantasy land at this point, because Nixon's asking Coulson if he thinks Haldeman and Ehrlichman were involved. He knows they were involved. Coulson knows they're involved. Everyone knows everyone else was involved, and yet he's still asking them openly what he thinks they knew and when. And Nixon vacillates. One day he's saying, "Oh, I'll never I'll never let John Mitchell get prosecuted. I'll resign the presidency before I allow that to happen. And then, not long later, he'll say, "Oh no, yeah, we've got it was all his fault, wasn't it? And we didn't know anything about it. He knew everything about it, but we didn't, did we?"
Wow.
It's getting into a weird place already. Yeah, on the 6th of December, Nixon's talking about the Senate hearings, says that they should, quote, "throw sand in their eyes," quote. In other words, doing everything they can to just frustrate the Senate hearings, because they realise that that's where it could all fall apart, because even if dodgy stuff comes out in front of the grand jury, it's not as explosive. Even if those grand jurors go on to write a book about it or something, it's still not the same as having the televised testimony of Haldeman, for example.
Sure. Yeah.
Millions of people viewing in live to see Haldeman squirm, so they realise that already, and they're worried about it.
I have no notes on the March 13th meeting, and I have no recollection of that meeting at all. I do not recall going into the president's office and interrupting the meeting with John Dean.
So in Nixon's past, there was this case when he was a younger man coming up where he prosecuted a guy, Alger Hiss, for being a communist and then kind of lying about being a communist. And it was like the hubris is unmissable, really, that he got this guy for lying, really, for a cover-up. And that's how they nailed him. And Nixon talks about the Hiss case quite a lot over the tapes. He brings it up all the time, like, "Oh, we did this," because he got a bit of an insight into conspiracy laws and perjury laws himself, but on the other side. And now it's coming back to bite him. So he talks about Hiss a fair bit, and all his main aides are kind of turning on each other a little bit at this point. It gets worse, but he brings them in one at a time, or sometimes two of them together, and they sort of kind of turn on each other a bit, saying, "Oh, I think maybe he knew more than he's saying." Mitchell he thinks that Ehrlichman knew more than he's saying, and Ehrlichman says Haldeman knows more than he's let you know, and it gets a bit he said, she said. But Nixon, again, doesn't just bring them all in together and try and rinse out the issues. He just allows it to go on like that. It's odd. And there's one bit on this day where Ehrlichman says that he's handed Pat Gray of the FBI, the head guy at the FBI, a brown envelope which has got loads of information about Howard Hunt, one of the main guys, one of the main burglar guys. So he lets Nixon know that on this day, that he's already done that a month before. But Nixon doesn't really ask for exactly what that information was or what Pat Gray did with it or anything like that. But it comes back to haunt them a bit. Because over the next couple of days, there's a lot of talk about Pat Gray's nomination. Because even though Nixon's put him in, he still has to get nominated. So there's a lot of talk about that. But Nixon tells Pat Gray that Mark Felt is leaking. The guy's actually deep throat. It turns out it's deep throat. And Gray doesn't believe him, doesn't think that's possible. And they both moan that it was much better under Hoover. People didn't really leak much at the FBI under Hoover. But it's funny, actually, a quick note on deep throat, that because nobody actually really knew until, apart from Woodward and Bernstein, and I think Ben Bradley knew, that there's like documentaries from the 80s and 90s where they're speculating that it's different people. I've seen a CBS one where they speculate it's Pat Gray himself. And it's funny, they say they think it might be Mark Felt, but they say he gave up smoking in 1948, so it couldn't be him. He couldn't be deep throat. And that's it. They just skate over him and move on. It's funny to see really well documented programs that have just got it wrong.
Yeah.
In the 90s. Yeah, but Pat Gray agrees. There's a recording of him basically agreeing with Nixon that if he does get nominated, he'll do some dodgy stuff on behalf of Nixon, like trailing people or bugging people in the future if he has to. So Pat Gray is sort of implicated in the whole thing to some extent. They keep talking about Magruder and keeping him happy, and Kleindienst, that they'll give them better jobs if they sort of keep towing the line and keep doing as they're told. But they're worried that people are going to have to be called before the Senate hearings now, and they try to start hatching plans that they'll try and get Mitchell to take all the blame. Yeah. It's a bit late. It's a bit later in this month that, for the first time, Nixon seems really flustered, like just jumping. But he can't really stay on one topic, and he keeps asking the same people the same things over and over again. There's one quote from the 23rd of February where he's actually recorded as saying, I'll deny that I ever heard it, i.e., plans to cover anything up.
Huh.
He says, another quote is, we'll have to play our games, which later they tried to say didn't mean a cover-up, but
Play
it
our
pretty,
games.
yeah, we'll play our
Right.
games, you know.
Yeah.
It becomes like a battle between the White House and the various enemies. There's all sorts of, committees and hearings going on and grand juries. You know, there's more than one show in town. I've heard it described like that.
Excellent.
Nixon, on this day as well, asks Ehrlichman crazily for one of the first times. He explicitly asks him, "Have you got a problem? You know, is it? Do you tell me now whether when things all come out, will you personally have a problem? Did you know anything?" And Ehrlichman explicitly says, "Quote, I don't have that problem," and he says it twice. And that's just an utter lie. Ehrlichman's in it up to his neck. He's one of the main guys, really.
Yeah.
So he just lies to Nixon massively on that day.
So,
Yeah. Sorry, go on. Yeah.
how many people knew that everything they were saying was being recorded? Did everyone in the office know that they were being taped?
Yeah. No, not at all. Even
Presumably his top
so,
presumably his top aides would have known, clearly.
no,
No.
no. It comes as a shock to nearly all of them. Haldeman knew,
Yeah.
and I think, well, I'm not 100% sure about Ehrlichman, whether he knew exactly, but a lot of them didn't. Like Kissinger didn't know, or they certainly didn't know that it was just on constantly.
Really? Kissinger
Yeah,
didn't know.
yeah, and
Blimey.
and and John Dean didn't know. There's a whole bit where he starts suspecting that it's being recorded, just the way Nixon's speaking
Right.
and making certain statements and leading him down certain paths. Yeah, he starts suspecting on a specific day that he might be being recorded while
Huh.
speaking to Nixon in the Oval Office. So he definitely didn't know for sure.
The president almost from the outset began asking me a number of leading questions, which was somewhat unlike his normal conversational relationships I'd had with him, which made me think that the conversation was being taped and a record was being made to protect himself. Although I became aware of this because of the nature of the conversation, I decided I did not know it for a fact and that I had to believe that the president would not tape such a conversation.
And Ehrlichman,
even
you don't know, like, so him saying
Yeah.
that, him saying like, I don't have that problem, because that sounds like he's totally going along with with the language that Nixon's using by saying, I don't have that problem. That sounds like the sort of stuff you say in front of a grand jury, or using specific weird language like that.
Yeah,
That does sound like the sort of stuff you would say.
it's quite possible that Ehrlichman knew. I should know exactly whether he did or not. Uh, I would have thought that because he was so senior, he is pretty much the top two guys under
Yeah.
Nixon. He may well have known. And as I said earlier, I think a lot more of it than most historians or commentators say is contrived. That's my opinion. That maybe a great deal of it is for the recording's sake.
Yeah.
Because they've got so much opportunity with someone like Ehrlichman. Nixon would have so much opportunity to talk to him off the record where they know 100% it's not being recorded.
Yeah. So where was it being recorded again? So it was in the
There's
office that he
various
did
few
most of
places.
his
Yeah,
day-to-day stuff.
there's the Oval Office, there's
Hmm.
his office in the EOB building,
Right, that's it.
Executive Office building,
Yeah.
and also in Camp David.
Oh yeah.
More than one phone at Camp David and the main study there.
But then
He
there's
had a residence in California called the Western White House, nicknamed that. I'm not sure, he may or may not have had one of his phones there recording as well, but it's mainly Camp David, the Oval Office, and the EOB, his
yeah.
EOB office.
But then in the hallway or in the room outside, a room next door, or in the toilet or whatever, he could just be saying to them, right, we're going to go back into the room, and I'm going to ask you, and you tell me you didn't know anything, or
Yeah, easily, really easily.
yeah.
One of the things Nixon liked was to take a little presidential cruise. He used to do that quite a lot, take his actual friends and have lunch on this cruise boat thing.
Lovely.
Go down the boat.
Mm.
So I get a feeling that would be the sort. I mean, that's so perfect, such a perfect example. But yeah, you take people on there and just intrigue with them. Yeah. Anyway, you could just walk outside the Oval Office and there's like a colonnade, covered
Yeah.
walkway. You just stand there and say, right, we're going to go back in and I'll explicitly ask you.
Yeah.
And you can deny it, and we've got it on tape. But who knows? Who knows? This is for historians to argue over forever, I guess.
Yeah. No, it's fascinating.
Yeah, so it's about this time that John Dean starts coming into the story significantly. Over the next few weeks, he's barely ever been in the Oval Office, if ever, and only met Nixon sort of in passing in staff meetings, not really had many or any one-to-ones with him. But over the next few weeks, he has something like 37 talks with Nixon, quite a lot of them one-on-ones inside the Oval Office. So suddenly Nixon's like latching onto John Dean, his counsel, to sort of help him out, I guess. And he does say that Nixon goes from loving him to sort of making him into an enemy very quickly. It's like a real up and down roller coaster for John Dean over the space of a few weeks. So Nixon brings him in one morning, a bit to his surprise, and it's the first of many mornings where he's brought in and talks to Nixon. And Nixon talks all about how the LBJ buggings were so out of order, and moaning more about the leaks, and how Judge Sirica is going too far and all this stuff. This is actually the moment when Nixon runs through the Chief Justices, calling them all different names. So embarrassing. You just shouldn't have that on tape. But Dean does tell him that that they've only really made it this far because, well, one quote is he says he'll put this thing in the funny pages of history books because it's so bizarre, and it's still, even at this stage, it's not definitely going to blow up the presidency or anything. It's not completely dominating every move every single day as it does later.
Right.
So they're still hoping that it can be just another one of those weird things that goes on under, all presidents have crazy stuff that go on under them. It doesn't usually reach them personally, does it? So they're still sort of in that mode, hoping that it would just become a joke. Wow. But yeah, in Nixon's diaries, he highly praises Dean at this point. And I said earlier that there's two key dates in the Nixon tapes. There's the smoking gun one, just a few days after the break-in, where he tells Haldeman to get the CIA, to get the FBI to back off. And the other really important date is March 21st. This is the date when John Dean comes into Nixon's office and basically tells him that there's a cancer on the presidency. He basically lays it down to Nixon. John Dean had realised that Haldeman and Ehrlichman and Coulson and Mitchell and all the other guys are playing their own games and sort of not really keeping Nixon completely informed in everything, whether it's deliberate, whether it's at Nixon's request, he doesn't know. But John Dean decides at this point that he's just going to tell Nixon what's going down, which he tries to do, or he starts to do, and Nixon keeps interrupting him and isn't really getting the point that he's trying to come clean. And John Dean saying, look, there's the initial break-in, then there's the cover-up, and people are getting closer to it. You can't contain it because investigative journalists and the Post are tracing the money back to Howard Hunt. So we we need to address this properly, like now. You may well have to fire me, Niles, as well as Haldeman and Ehrlichman and everyone. At one point, he says that John Dean says to Nixon, "Look, these guys are asking for loads and loads of money." And weirdly, Nixon says, "Well, how much money?" Which is not really a response you'd want to hear. And John Dean says back to Nixon, in his book, The Nixon Defense, and actually in his earlier memoir, Blind Ambition, John Dean says that he made up just a huge figure to make the president see that it was so absurd, or that's what he claims. But it's on the tape as him saying, I guess these guys are going to need, over the next year or something, they're going to need $1 million. To which Nixon replies, me. You could get $1 million and you could get it in cash. I know where it could be gotten. I mean, it's not easy, but it could be done. Quote.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Which is just a bit mental, isn't it? That's just the response of a criminal, really. Isn't it?
Yeah. That's amazing. Oh my God. Does he not? Oh.
We have a cancer within close to the presidency that's growing. And it basically is because, one, we're being blackmailed. Two, people are going to start perjuring themselves very quickly. It'll cost money. It's dangerous. People around here are not pros at this sort of thing. This sort of thing mafia people can do. It's a tough thing to know how to do. I would say these people are going to cost $1 million over the next few years.
You can get $1 million, and you can get it in cash. I know where it can be gotten. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's not easy, but it can be done.
And he knows that it's been recorded.
Yeah. And this bit gets crazy because that's, like I say, this day and this conversation and that quote specifically becomes one of the things that really sinks Nixon, especially to history. That doesn't come out for a while,
Right.
that he said this, but that's more than a smoking gun.
I'd love to know what money he's talking about. Where is that cash? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, well, there's a few different ways. One, he's got a really
campaigns.
rich friend, lives down in Miami. I think an ex-Cuban guy who's just got loads of money that Nixon could call on if he needed to. And also his campaign has got millions of dollars in cash. People just sending cash.
That's right, yeah.
It's crazy.
That's great.
And later, Nixon would get Haldeman to claim that Nixon did say that, but at the end, he says, but that would be wrong. Haldeman claims that, and Nixon also claims that during one period that he said all that. He said, we can get you the money. We could get you the money, but that would be wrong. Now, the tapes show that he never said that bit after. And that's one of the reasons why Haldeman goes down. Haldeman says under oath that that's what Nixon said. And then when it's proven wrong, he's guilty of perjury.
He's perjured himself, yeah.
Yeah.
That's so dumb.
Yeah.
So it's like a tiny little thing at the end just to soften the blow, and that is committing a crime. That's so dumb.
And when it started to emerge a bit later in the story that there were tapes at all, John Dean is so happy because he knows it will prove that what he said was true. And Nixon's account isn't true. Yeah, when the tapes come out, some people assume Nixon is telling the truth. And for a very short period of time, Nixon's sort of diehard camp are jubilant because they think he's going to exonerate him completely, but obviously they don't know. So yeah, the March 21st conversation ends up consuming Nixon one way or another. So that's a really key date. Straight after this, Haldeman and Ehrlichman start turning on each other with one-on-ones with Nixon. They are saying that the other one knew more than they're telling you, and that sort of thing. And then over the weekend of the 13th, 14th, 15th, around then of April, the cover-up starts really collapsing. They realise that, well, John Dean's going to get called before the grand jury, and then obviously later the Senate hearings, and they realise that he's not going to lie. He's not prepared to perjure himself. So that's a real worry for them. Mm-hmm. And Nixon starts to realise that maybe he is really going to have to fire Haldeman and Ehrlichman and maybe lots of others. There's something happens on June 15th. There's all this talk about the 18 and a half minutes of missing tape at the very beginning. But on April 15th, the entire day is gone. Just gone. And from what everyone who was close to it who knows, they say that would have been a terrible day for Haldeman and Nixon. That was one of the days when Nixon and Haldeman would have had to have had a heart-to-heart and talk about exactly how and when they fucked up and if and when Haldeman's going to have to be fired. And that whole day is just missing.
Wow.
It's just gone. So again, it makes this 18 and a half minutes of missing tape just silly. It's just not as important as loads of other things. But all these guys are still employed. John Dean is still employed. He's still got his job, technically. Nixon tries to call him up and say, oh, by the way, you know that $1 million thing? Yeah, I was just joking about that. You know that, right? That was a joke. Obviously, I wouldn't really consider trying to pay them off with $1 million, which is, I mean, it's really pathetic. It's like...
It's embarrassing. It's just embarrassing now.
Yeah. The next day, the 16th, Haldeman and Ehrlichman and Dean all sort of write resignation letters and give them to Nixon. It doesn't mean they're fired or anything, but, you know, the writing's on the wall. You know, the press don't get that information, but they all do it. Haldeman and Ehrlichman try and stab Dean this is when everyone starts turning on Dean. They say, oh, he knew everything. He was like the desk officer for the whole thing. He was in it with Liddy from the beginning, but he was instructed to by Nixon, right? You know, John Dean didn't actually have anything to do with the illegal acts in the first place. He had everything to do with the cover-up, but because he was ordered to. And they're trying to make out that he was sort of the brains behind it, in a way. Earlier, Nixon had ordered John Dean to go away to Camp David and sort of collect any and all information on the Watergate cover-up, put it into one sort of dossier to present to Nixon. But John Dean realises that that's setting himself up for a fall, sort of saying that he knew everything about it and putting his name over the top of it. That would be really easy for Nixon to say, well, until that day, I didn't know anything about it. In fact, that's what Nixon says. This famous Cancer on the Presidency day and the $1 million payoff conversation. After that, Nixon claims that that was the day he realised that there was real corruption within his White House, which is obviously not true. He knew from the beginning. But he always claimed after that that was the first time he really realised, and that John Dean himself was at the heart of it. So yeah, they all start turning on each other, and it all starts kind of crumbling from the point onwards with increasing speed. So late in April, Nixon decides, we're not exactly sure when, but somewhere between the 21st and 24th of April, Nixon makes a decision that he has to fire Haldeman and Ehrlichman. The pressure in the press and in the grand jury and the Senate hearings that are going to be coming up, it's just becoming too much. He realises he has to cut his losses with those guys. And whenever you watch maybe a documentary about this, it just says something along the lines that I just said, and then it just shows Nixon doing his speech to the nation, saying that he had to cut off my left arm, then I cut off my right arm, that one. But the reality is quite different. He phones up Haldeman and says, apparently it was quite emotional, but you have to accept that I need you to resign. And apparently Haldeman accepts it, but Ehrlichman doesn't. So much so that he convinces Haldeman that he doesn't have to accept it either. And they get their own lawyers to sort of argue with Nixon about that they shouldn't have to go and that they didn't do anything wrong, and then they can prove they didn't do anything wrong. Yeah, I mean, it all ultimately fails because Nixon knows he's in a bind and there's very few ways out. But yeah, they do not go easily whatsoever. I mean, eventually they do. Days and days later they do. So even after they've been fired, they've still got access to the Oval Office and Nixon. Even after he's gone on TV and publicly said that he's had to fire these guys, Haldeman's still in the Oval Office, just talking to Nixon in the mornings and talking about the tapes and what may or may not be on the tapes.
No way.
Yeah. I mean, Nixon even orders Haldeman to go through some of the key tapes and listen to them. Nixon doesn't even do it himself. I don't know whether he can't be bothered, or I'm sure it's not that, or he can't face it, or for legal reasons he thinks it's best he doesn't personally do it. But he orders Haldeman to listen to the March 21st tape and the tapes really early on, the smoking gun tapes, and make notes and report back to him what's in the tapes.
After he's fired him?
Yeah.
Oh, man.
Now, these tapes, later on, Nixon does everything he can to prevent the federal system, the federal law system, from seeing these tapes. So that, again, is another crime. If you're withholding evidence from a federal court and yet allowing someone that's going to be prosecuted because of that evidence, allowing them access to it, Haldeman's listening to conversations that he's involved in.
Yeah.
You're early, John.
If you'd been that stealthy at the Watergate, we wouldn't be in this mess. Sorry to hear about your wife.
Yes. I got the money.
The president would like to know if that was the last payment.
I'll bet he would.
Is it?
In Richard Nixon's long history of underhanded dealings, he's never had better value for his money. If I were to open my mouth, all the dominoes would fall.
Can I ask you a question? How the hell do you have the temerity to blackmail the President of the United States?
That's not the question, John. The question is, why is he paying?
To protect his people.
I'm one of his people. The Cubans are his people, and we're going to jail for him.
Howard, you will serve no more than 2 years. Then he'll pardon you.
Maybe. Maybe not. But you don't leave your men on the beach, John. You don't make them beg for their money like thieves. You don't dump men with families who serve their country.
He didn't know. This thing has gotten out of hand.
Do you think a man as controlled as Richard Nixon would have allowed a break-in at the Democratic National Headquarters without knowing it? You really think John Mitchell or Bob Haldeman wouldn't have run it by him at least once? The president's men did nothing. Nothing without Richard Nixon's permission. John, sooner or later, sooner, I think, you're going to learn the lesson that's been learned by everyone who's ever gotten close to Richard Nixon. That he's the darkness, reaching out for the darkness. And eventually, it's either you or him. Your grave's already been dug, John.